Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We want to say thank you for coming and welcome to the fourth day of the TRC Diaspora hearings. To begin this morning, I ask that we can all stand and observe a few moments of silence. Please stand with us. Thank you very much. Please be seated. Sorry, I will just ask you quickly to remain standing and let's administer the oath. Sorry, can you raise your right hand? Okay.
I,
Your name.
Herman J. Cohen,
Do promise
that my testimony
I
have come to give
to the TRC of Liberia
to the TRC of Liberia
is the truth
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Good morning.
With us. These forums are intended to retrospect on the history of Liberia, past developments, as a way of understanding the conflict, and at the same time, as Liberians finding a way forward. And issues very often has come about relating to Liberian and U.S. relationships, especially during the period of the conflict, and the role our international partners play, what contributions they made, either to assist us in obtaining the peace we now have, or what they could have done better and all of that. U.S.-Liberia relationship is always focused because of the long-standing traditional relationship we have had with the United States. And you were, at some point in time, during the early days, I think of Samuel Doe between 87 and 93, a U.S. diplomat and under secretary. It is in that capacity we appreciate that you have come to share your experience during those times, perhaps to throw light on some of the things that happened, what role the U.S. played, how the conflict came about, whatever information can assist us in understanding the past. At this moment, I will take time to introduce members of the Commission, and then we ask some preliminary questions on who you are and some of those persons. I'm very sorry, Ambassador, I hope you understood me. I will introduce members of the Commission at this time, and then we'll move into your testimony. Right. Sitting at your right is Commissioner Sheikh Kafuma Kone. Next to him is Commissioner Per Brown-Bull. Next to her is Commissioner Gerald Coleman. And immediately at my left is Commissioner Dede Dolope. Immediate at my right is Commissioner Massa Washington, Commissioner John Stewart, and Commissioner Umu Sila. I am Jerome Verdier. We say welcome and thanks. Can you kindly repeat your name?
Herman J. Cohen.
Current residence, please.
Washington, D.C.
Can you confirm that you were Under Secretary of State for African Affairs.
Yes, I was from 1989 to 1993.
1989 to 1983. 1993. During that period, did you visit Liberia at any point in time?
I visited several times, yes.
Several times.
I was also director for Africa in the White House from 1987 to 1989. So I also visited at that time.
Okay. Thank you, sir. That is sufficient for now. You may kindly proceed with your testimony.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to give testimony. I hope it will be useful. It's from a different perspective. It's from a policy perspective as opposed to a direct involvement in the events on the ground. I joined the White House staff in January 1987. I was working for President Reagan as his Africa advisor. And within 1 week, I went to Africa with Secretary of State George Shultz. Our first stop was Liberia. And we met several times with President Doe. And I was present in all of these meetings, and we found President Doe to be very upset with the U.S. He felt that we weren't helping Liberia enough, we weren't supporting him, and he said that he was America's best friend in Africa, and therefore he thought we were not recognizing this. Secretary Shultz's main objective was to persuade President Doe that they needed some sort of improvements in their budgetary systems, in their fiscal systems, in their management. Otherwise, we would not be able to give aid to Liberia. You know, U.S. aid has to be accounted for, it has to be audited and what have you, and there were absolutely no systems. So he persuaded President Doe to accept a group of American experts to come and help set up an accounting system for the government. And then we left. It was all a very friendly visit. Secretary Shultz was robed as a chief and what have you. Experts came, and after 6 months, the U.S. ambassador asked me to come over and talk to President Doe because he was not cooperating with these experts. And so I went over, I saw President Doe. I said, in order to have a good relationship and to get U.S. assistance, he should accept the advice of these experts who had come and helped set up all of these accounting systems. But it didn't work out, so the U.S. ambassador sent the experts home. And so there was really no change in the relationship. It was friendly, but we really weren't doing much. I think most of what we were doing was help to the Army. We had a military assistance team there. We were providing uniforms, vehicles, and what have you. So I did not pay that much attention to Liberia while I was working in the White House. And then President Bush came into office, and he asked me to be Undersecretary for African Affairs, which I assumed those duties in April of 1989. And I immediately plunged into some active conflicts going on: Sudan, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique. And I was not doing much with Liberia at the time. But on Christmas Eve of 1989, there was this group of guerrillas came in to Nimba County from neighboring Cote d'Ivoire and started shooting and proclaiming that they were coming in to get rid of Samuel Doe. We knew that these guerrilla fighters had been trained in Libya and that their arms had come from Burkina Faso, and they were getting full support from Ivory Coast. So they had full access to the territory of Ivory Coast, and they were using that as a base, and they were coming in to attack the government of Samuel Doe. Our first reports were that the army, Liberian army, was trying to counter these guerrillas, and that they were using a very unfortunate tactic, which was wherever guerrillas were spotted, they would, in a village, they would go in and burn down the whole village and kill all the people there, fellow Liberians. And this got us very upset. So we decided to send U.S. military people out with the Liberian army. These were people from the U.S. mission, military assistance mission, to help them deal with this conflict without killing innocent people and committing human rights violations. We did that. We sent people out. But when this became known in the United States, there was a lot of objection posed by people in the United States, especially people from the Liberian diaspora, who said that we were helping the government of Doe fight the guerrillas, and the guerrillas were trying to get rid of Doe, so therefore we should not do that. There appeared to be a great deal of opposition to Doe within the diaspora, and they were calling their congressmen and what have you. So as a result of that, we withdrew the advisors from the Liberian army, and therefore the atrocities continued against villages that had guerrillas operating from them. Because of the Liberian army atrocities, the incoming guerrillas led by Charles Taylor were able to gather a lot of support from young people who were saying they're killing our people in the villages. So they joined Charles Taylor's guerrilla force, and it expanded, and it started to expand. So by, I would say by the middle of April of 1990, they had expanded and taken over a great deal of Liberian territory. We tried to engage in diplomatic mediation. The government of Samuel Doe sent a team over to Washington led by Winston Tubman to talk about what could be done. And we also had a representative, Charles Taylor, who was living in New Jersey at the time, Mr. Wowiyu, I'm not pronouncing it right. He was living in New Jersey, and he came to Washington representing Charles Taylor. And we were discussing Taylor's demands that Doe step down and that there be a new election. And Taylor's demand was, as soon as Doe steps down and resigns, we will stop fighting and we'll just go for an election. We tried to persuade Doe to accept an early election. He said that the Constitution called for an election to be held, I believe, in 1993, I believe, when his mandate was up. I'm not sure if that date is accurate. So we said, well, move up the election to an early date. And we started bargaining with Doe, and he said, okay, we'll have it 6 months from now, what have you. And in the meantime, the guerrilla forces were moving closer and closer to Monrovia. And the army was falling back and not doing a very good job in defending against these guerrilla actions. The talks sort of broke down and no results, I think, around March or April. So we came up with a plan. We saw that the guerrillas were really winning the war. They were coming very close to Monrovia, and the Liberian army was really falling back to Monrovia, and that's all that was left for Doe. So we said that the main objective was to stop the fighting because a lot of innocent people were suffering from that, and Monrovia itself was becoming a very, very dangerous place. A lot of refugees had come into Monrovia. There was a lot of ethnic violence. Ethnic groups that were considered to be supporting Charles Taylor, the Gio and the Mano, they were being treated very badly in Monrovia by the government. And on the other side, within Taylor's area of control, the Mandingo and the Kran were being treated very badly. There was a sanitation problem in Monrovia. There was disease breaking out. So we said we had to do something to stop the fighting. And we started talking to Doe about leaving Liberia and going into exile. And we had long discussions with him through our ambassador, and finally persuaded him that it should time for him to go. And we were willing to provide transportation. Of course, the understanding was that if he left, Charles Taylor would come in and take power. Charles Taylor was unable to take power by force because he could not defeat the army inside Monrovia. He just never was able to do it. We were talking to him by satellite phone, and he kept saying, next week I'll be capturing Monrovia, and he never did. The Liberian army was unable to fight outside of Monrovia, but with inside Monrovia, they just prevented Taylor from coming in. While he kept promising to capture Monrovia, the situation inside Monrovia was very bad. People were dying of disease, hunger, what have you. Ethnic violence was taking place. So we persuaded Doe to accept the idea of leaving. I personally called up President Eyadema of Togo and asked if he would accept Doe and his family. And Eyadema said yes, he would do that. And we started planning to take Doe out. We talked to Taylor about opening up a corridor to Sierra Leone so that troops from the Army of Liberia could escape. They felt that they had to fight to the death because they would be killed if Taylor came in, so we wanted to give them a way of getting out. And Taylor said he had agreed to that, and so they left open a corridor, but this was defeated because Prince Johnson broke away from Taylor, and he blocked the corridor. So it was very hard for him for the Liberian troops to get out. But anyway, we continued with our scheme to send an airplane to Liberia to get Taylor and his family out of the country. I visited, this came later. At this point, when we were about to send our aircraft from Europe to pick up Doe, I received a word from the White House that we should cease all activities dealing with the Liberian conflict, just stop doing anything. So that the plan, I was not given any explanation for that. So all of our plans were just halted right there. And so Doe was not taken out of the country, and the war continued. Since we decided not to follow up on our plans, the responsibility for doing anything to stop the fighting was passed, in effect, to the West African governments. Now, you must remember that the training, equipping, and financing of the Taylor guerrillas came from Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire and Libya. So they were part of the West African community. Libya was not, but Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire were part of the community. So there were meetings of the West African Economic Community known as ECOWAS. And the Nigerians and Ghanaians were very upset about what was going on in Monrovia. They had a large number of their nationals living in Monrovia who were caught up in the fighting. Sierra Leone was also upset about that. So they had a discussion, and the Nigerians, Ghanaians, Sierra Leoneans, and Republic of Guinea said that they must send an intervention force to stop the fighting in Liberia. Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire were opposed because they were supporting Charles Taylor, and they wanted Charles Taylor to win. They did not want to stop the war until Charles Taylor was victorious. But against the opposition of Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, a peacekeeping force was raised by the West Africans, and they landed in Monrovia area. We supported this because we were very worried about the conditions in Monrovia. We were unable to get any aid into Monrovia. The port was blocked. Charles Taylor's forces were shelling the port. We could not send ships in there. So the West African ECOWAS forces, known as ECOMOG, landed in Monrovia. I forgot which month. I believe it was April, and immediately pushed back Charles Taylor from Monrovia and relieved the situation inside Monrovia. So we were able to bring medical supplies, food, whatever was needed to relieve the humanitarian situation. So at that point, the United States government essentially was not doing anything. Our only responsibility at that point was to worry about U.S. citizens in Liberia. And we sent a naval task force offshore to help evacuate any U.S. citizen who wanted to leave. And at some point, we sent Marines into the center of Monrovia to help gather these people and bring them out to the ships. I don't remember how many actually came out. We estimated there were 5,000 U.S. citizens living in Liberia, and I think maybe several hundred did come out. So basically, the issue was one for the West African countries. They said that they were there to keep the peace, and they wanted to have an election and all that, but Charles Taylor did not trust them. He felt that they were coming in to keep Doe in power. So he started a war with the West African forces. In August, the White House asked me to go out to West Africa to survey the situation and talk to everyone. I started with the president of Guinea, in Conakry, who told me the whole problem, you must blame the president of Cote d'Ivoire. He orchestrated the whole thing, Houphouët-Boigny, and he's totally at fault. There would never have been any fighting, any guerrilla forces, without his money, his training, and his support for Charles Taylor. I then went to Sierra Leone, and I got the same story from President Momo. It's all the fault of Houphouët-Boigny. I then flew from Freetown to Monrovia. There was fighting in the streets, so I landed in a helicopter on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, and I didn't stay 24 hours, I stayed less than 24 hours. And I met at the embassy with Prince Johnson. I was unable to meet with President Doe. I met with Prince Johnson. I found him to be rather, how shall we say, very emotional, very wild in his discussions. I had the feeling he may have been taking drugs at the time, but he was really a very incoherent person. So I didn't get much out of him. I flew from Monrovia to Abidjan, and I met with President Houphouët, and I said, what can you tell me about this war in Liberia? He said, I don't know anything about it. I never met Charles Taylor. I have no knowledge of anything, against the background of all these other presidents telling me that Houphouët started the whole thing. And he said, sorry, I can't help you. I don't know anything. So I said, okay, Mr. President, but you're very influential. You're the elder statesman of this region. What can you do to help bring about peace in Liberia? He said, I'll do my best. So this started these various Yamoussoukro meetings that he was calling to help bring about peace. I flew from, this was in August, by the way, of 1990. I flew from Abidjan to Man, M-A-N, which is on the border of Liberia, and I went inside Liberia with the U.S. ambassador to Abidjan, and I met with Charles Taylor in his camp, which was about 20 kilometers inside the border in Liberia, and he was surrounded by young boys, I would say 12 to 14 years old, carrying these very heavy machine guns, Kalashnikovs and what have you. It was very frightening to go in there. And we met with Charles Taylor. He was sitting in a sort of like a throne, and behind him was a picture of President Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy. So it sounded like Kennedy was his role model. But anyway, he was very cordial. We had a nice discussion. And he kept repeating the same thing. He said, I just want Doe to leave. Once he leaves, I'll go back and we'll just have an election. My personal interest is not having power. It's just to get rid of Samuel Doe, because Liberia needs to get rid of him. Otherwise, there'll be no progress. So I said, well, if that's the case, would you accept a ceasefire between you and ECOWAS? And he said, yes, I would. And he said, I said, the Marines are here. And he said, send the Marines, and we'll surrender to the Marines. I said, do you really mean that? He said, yes, I'll surrender to the Marines. We all trust the U.S. Marines. So I reported this to Washington, and Washington got very upset with me, saying, we gave you strict instructions not to get involved with ending the war or doing anything about the war, so you must stop doing that. Anyway, I went back to Washington, and our main concern after I got back was making sure that all Liberian Americans living in Liberia got out, and that we did all we could to alleviate humanitarian concerns inside Liberia by sending in relief supplies. And we gave support to ECOWAS. We provided money and we provided supplies to ECOWAS. After President Doe was assassinated, we just sort of continued to play back behind-the-scenes role with the West African governments in the lead. There were discussions in Freetown between representatives of Taylor and an interim government that had been set up by the West Africans, and we were observers at that. We helped promote it. I think the talks were held at the U.S. Embassy in Sierra Leone. But beyond that, we really didn't do much to try to end the hostilities and the fighting. So throughout my time, when I left office in 1993, that was about our role in Liberia. We didn't, we supported the Yamoussoukro meetings, but we didn't play an active role in trying to bring about peace in Liberia. This only took place later, after I left office during the Clinton administration, where the United States government became more active in helping to to do mediation and to bring about a solution to the problem. What else can I say about that? I think that's about the main thing that I observed. One of the main points I want to make for this commission is that some of the greatest tragedies in Africa have come about through what I call surrogate war. Surrogate war. Now, sometimes you have a situation in an African country that is so bad that the people feel justified in rising up against a ruler. Look at Zimbabwe today, for example. It's so bad that they are totally justified. The situation in Angola was similar. But sometimes there's no reason to have a war. And sometimes these wars are started by outside powers who want to change the regime for their own purposes. And this is the case of Liberia. Now, a lot of people were opposed to Samuel Doe. They felt he should go. A lot of Liberians, both inside Liberia and outside Liberia. And I agree that I think he was not a suitable president for that country. They needed a free and fair election to get the right people in office. But that did not justify a war, which totally destroyed the whole country. I remember talking to Taylor on a satellite phone, and I said, one thing I want you to do, promise me, is you will not destroy the infrastructure. You had a dam which supplied electricity to Monrovia. You had all sorts of things. You had all sorts of communication stations. And he said, I will not touch the infrastructure. But by the time the war was over, the infrastructure was totally destroyed. There's no electricity in Monrovia because the dam it doesn't exist anymore. So why did these outside countries start this war? There would not have been a war in Liberia without these outside powers. I asked Houphouët, and he said, I never heard of it. But he's the one who financed it and provided all the training and selected Charles Taylor. In 1991, I went to the first Sullivan Summit in Abidjan, and I met with the president of Burkina Faso. I said, well, I understand you supplied arms to Charles Taylor and helped him start this war. He said, yes, I did. And I said, why did you do that? He said, well, he was a horrible leader. He was corrupt. He was stealing everything. He had to go. I said, but look what happened. The country was destroyed. He said, well, we expected the war to be over in 30 days. Charles Taylor would take power, and that would be it, and Liberia would see a new day. I said, well, it didn't work out that way. The war is still going on, and it's terrible. He said, yes, I'm sorry I did it. I really am sorry I did it. And I said, well, at least now, 2 years later, will you stop supplying arms to Charles Taylor so that ECOMOG can bring about a peacekeeping operation and bring about elections? He says, yes, I will stop sending arms. But he never did stop. He kept going because he had an investment in Charles Taylor, and he wanted absolutely Charles Taylor to win. And then he did not trust the West African forces because he opposed the operation. And Houphouët never openly discussed it with me because he said, I had never heard of this. But he wanted to work for peace. A couple of years later, I believe it was 1992, we had a state visit from the president of Senegal. Abdou Diouf came to Washington. And at that time, the problem with the negotiations at Yamoussoukro and other places between Taylor and the West Africans were continuing. And one of the demands of Charles Taylor was that he didn't want Nigerian and Ghanaian troops there because they were the enemy. He didn't trust them. He wanted someone not connected with the war, a neutral party to send troops. So when Abdou Diouf came in to Washington, we said, would you be willing to send Senegalese troops to be a neutral group to help bring about trust so that the war could end? And Abdou Diouf said, I'd be glad to do it, but we'll need help, we'll need we'll need equipment, and we'll need transportation. So President Bush agreed to provide that. And we did manage to send a battalion of Senegalese troops to be part of the peacekeeping operation. And Taylor had promised that if we sent a neutral force, that they would be respected and they would be working with them to bring about peace. So what happened on the first occasion, Taylor's people ambushed a Senegalese patrol and killed everybody. Here were these neutral forces came in, and Taylor's people just killed them all. And needless to say, the Senegalese were rather upset about that, and they withdrew their troops. So that is about the story of U.S. involvement. It did not. Now, why did the U.S. Did the White House overrule me in stopping the scenario where we're going to take Doe out with a U.S. Air Force plane and allow Taylor to come in? Why did that happen? Well, there was never any real explanation until years later when General Scowcroft was interviewed. He was the National Security Advisor to President Bush. He said, well, we knew that if we had done that, we would be totally responsible for Liberia from then on. In other words, we would be responsible for just taking care of Liberia, which I thought was not a good analysis. They should have asked me. I would have told them that that would not be the case. But anyway, that was why the decision was made to overrule me. Now you might ask, well, what would have been good if Taylor came in, who turned out to be pretty bad president? Well, at least if he had come in at that time in early 1990, the country would not have been destroyed, and all of this humanitarian disaster would not have happened. He would have turned out to be not a nice dictator, but at least we would have avoided this total destruction of the country. So I thought that, I was very sorry that we did not go through with that plan early in 1990. Later, after I retired, when Taylor became president in the first election, he asked me to come over to see what advice I could give. He actually hired me as a consultant for 3 months. And I went over there and I saw that the Vice Minister of Finance at the time, whose name I can't remember, had been working with the World Bank and had developed a very, very competent economic plan to bring about economic recovery. But it would have involved all sorts of reforms, transparency in the accounting, making sure that all revenues coming in from state-owned companies would go into the budget and what have you. And it was an excellent plan, and I recommended to President Taylor that he adopt the plan and sign an agreement with the World Bank. He thanked me for my advice, but he never implemented that. He preferred to work outside the World Bank and run the country according to his own criteria. So after that point, I had no longer any contact with him or with Liberia in any fashion. So I'll stop there. By the way, I wrote all of this, much of this, in a book that I wrote about my work in conflict in Africa, and one chapter is devoted to Liberia. So you may want to, you're welcome to consult that. It's called Intervening in Africa. And I give a lot of these details about our work on the policy level. So I'll stop there now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We appreciate sharing your experiences and with us, reflecting the period 1983 up to 2000, 1987 up to 1993, and even beyond when you were in active public service. When I say we Liberians have always had second thoughts about what America did, what America didn't do, what America should have done, even during the conflict and beyond. And these have been overwhelming concerns. We are happy that you have come in to provide a lot of information which up to now has not been made public and has been the subject of conjectures and speculations and rumors and all of that. So thank you very much. And commissioners at this time will ask some questions. Sheikh.
Very much, Ambassador Cohen, for your frank statement. As you may know, I became involved in the peace process of Liberia through the Interfaith Mediation Committee, which you are familiar with. If I may ask, can you tell this commission, and through this commission, the people of the Republic of Liberia, Africa, and the world, when, how, and where America-Liberia relations began?
When did they begin?
Yeah, how, when, and where?
Well, this is a historic question. I may not be that expert on it, but as you know, the origin of the colonization of the Liberian coast, I believe, began in the 1820s, where some people in the United States felt that slaves who had been freed would really be incompatible with life in the United States, and therefore they would be much better. It would be better both for the United States and for them to go back to their country, their area of origin, which is West Africa. So this was the beginning of colonization of the Liberian coast. Now, when Liberia became an actual republic, I don't remember the exact date, but from that time on, I believe it was in the 1840s, the United States established diplomatic relations with Liberia. So it was, there was an opportunity for the United States to have a colony like the British and the French had. It was unfortunate that, that Liberia did not become a U.S. colony, because the countries around Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, French Guinea, and Ivory Coast, all had much more development as a result of colonization. They had roads, they had health services, they had education services, which Liberia lacked. They did not have the resources to have that because there was not a colony. It was an independent republic. So U.S.-Liberian relations were quite normal throughout the 19th century, right up to the Second World War. If Liberia had been a colony, it would have been a bigger country, because the British and the French were snipping off parts of Liberia and getting away with it. There was no one stopping them. So I think the experience, the U.S. probably, both Liberia and the U.S. would have been better off if it had been a U.S. colony like the Philippines. Philippines was set free right after the Second World War. I'm doing some research now on the history of U.S. policy in Africa, and I came across a conversation between President Roosevelt in 1945 and some African-American journalists. And they said, well, the war is about to be ending. What are you going to do about Africa? And Roosevelt had never even thought about Africa. So he said, go over there and come back and give me your recommendations. So they went to Liberia, and they went to Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Ivory Coast. And they came back and they saw Roosevelt, and he said, what did you find? He said, Liberia is a disgrace to the United States. All these other countries are wealthy. Liberia is very poor. So Roosevelt wrote a memo saying, let's do something for Liberia, and what they did was build up the port of Monrovia. This was the beginning of the port of Monrovia. Now, of course, Roberts Field was built because of the Second World War, where we needed this field for sending our forces through to the Middle East and beyond. My own brother, who was old enough to be in the war, landed at Roberts Field, and then he went on to India when he was in the U.S. Army doing that. So the whole history of U.S.-Liberian relations was one of good relations, but keeping Liberia at arm's length. Well, the whole reason for Liberia's existence was to send freed slaves away from the U.S. So therefore, we wanted to keep them away. We didn't want to keep them close, you see. So that framed the whole relationship. And I sympathized with Samuel Doe in his meeting with Schultz when he said, you know, we're doing everything for you. We're your best friend in Africa. Whenever there's a vote in the UN, we're with you. We defend you all the time. And what are you doing for us? Not much. When the U.S. invaded Panama, there was a vote in the UN to condemn the U.S. for invading a sovereign country. And the vote was something like 160-3 against the U.S. Now, who were the three who voted to support the U.S.? Israel, Liberia, and the U.S. were the three votes. So Liberia we could always count on Liberia. We needed the airfield, we didn't even have to ask permission. We had these antenna fields for the CIA and the Voice of America.
Yeah.
It was all there. And yet the U.S. sort of took Liberia for granted. And I'm just giving you my personal opinion there. But what really troubled me is that I was not allowed to go with this scheme to get Doe out and bring Taylor to power, which would have averted the total thing. And also, I learned a lesson as a diplomat that we should not tolerate surrogate wars. I don't think the people of Liberia were ready for a war against Doe. They may have disapproved of him or unhappy with him, but I didn't think they wanted a civil war where tribes would be killing each other. But it was brought about by outsiders. It was brought about by outsiders, and it was totally unjustified. And I think this should be brought to the light of day, because surrogate wars continue in Africa today. They're continuing. There's the war in Rwanda was like that. The war in Darfur is a surrogate war. And I think it's time for blame to be pointed at those people outside of countries who start these things. The president of Burkina Faso told me he was sorry, but, thanks a lot.
Thank you for that response. Do we then conclude from the response you have just given, taking into account how Liberia was established, America being initiator, and coupled with the fact that during the Second World War, Liberia risked its national sovereignty to declare war against Hitler, and during the United Nations election at the time of establishing Israel, Liberia broke the ties. Was it justifiable, logical, and grateful for that relationship in time of distress, of war, to just download that and in your own statement to say Liberia has no more interest in America has no more interest in Liberia?
Well, the U.S. has always been interested in Liberia, but after the Bush administration left, I think the Clinton administration became much more active. I was not part of that, but they became much more active in trying to bring about an end to the war in Liberia. I think the Clinton administration provided quite a lot of money, both for humanitarian relief, support for peacekeepers, and what have you. So there was an interest, and I think part of the reason for that is the great support that Liberia has always had from the diaspora. I mean, it's hard for the U.S. government to ignore the diaspora. They vote, they write letters to congressmen and what have you. So the United States has always wanted to has always taken an interest in Liberia, but whether it was enough and whether they did enough, that's something to be discussed. I think we took Liberia for granted. I think finally now, maybe that may be at an end. I think now we're paying much more attention to Liberia.
Can you tell us, if you know, knowing the security system of America, how Mr. Taylor escaped from prison?
When he was in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I don't know how he escaped. Let me give you some background there. He was head of General Services Department, right? And he left. He was being pursued by the Liberian government for investigation of corruption, fraud, stealing money. And he was in Massachusetts, and on the request of the Liberian government, he was arrested pending extradition, which is a normal procedure. there is an extradition treaty between the U.S. and Liberia. So he was being held by the state of Massachusetts. And what was needed was a documentation that could be given to the judge in Massachusetts that would enable the judge to decide whether he should be extradited to Liberia for trial. After his arrest, a long period of time went by and there were no documents supplied. Nothing came in from Monrovia in support of this extradition. So he was sitting in jail waiting to be dealt with through the judicial system. But nothing happened until, while they were waiting for these documents. And he escaped. I think he had been in prison something like 6 months. Now, how he escaped, I don't know. I have no knowledge. I have some suspicions that some people were tired of feeding him. And since he had not committed any crimes in the U.S., he was not accused of any crimes in the U.S., why continue feeding this gentleman? And if he's wanted so badly in Liberia, why didn't they get these paperwork in, you see? So you can draw your own conclusions from that.
My last is, before the starting of the war, there were many outcries in Liberia concerning human rights violations, dictatorships. But in your general testimony, you said you and the Secretary of State, Shaw, visited Liberia only to discuss with the Doe government budgetary adjustments, because you have felt that there was mismanagement. Do we then understand from that statement that the interests of the United States was never centered around human rights, democracy, justice, but budgetary system?
Well, let me put it this way. Until 1990, there were no democracies in Africa. Maybe you can consider Senegal and Botswana semi-democracies in those times, but all of African countries were one-party states and one-party dictatorships. All of Africa was like that. And all of them had various degrees of human rights abuses, corruption, rigged elections, and what have you. So the U.S. policy up until 1990 was really, well, this is the way Africa is, and we're not in a position to tell Africa what to do. Where there are really egregious human rights violations, we really took action, and we had the annual human rights report, which pointed all this out. But we did not have an aggressive policy to promote democracy until President Bush announced this in early 1990. And we started spending money to promote democracy. And the main thing is that Africans themselves were starting to put pressure on their own governments to democratize. So then you had the beginning of multi-party democracy. But until 1990, our policy was more attuned toward the Cold War and economic development. We really had no emphasis on these other issues. So we weren't treating Liberia differently from any other African country at the time. That's the way Africa was.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Former Honor Secretary of State for African Affairs, Ambassador Cohen, for your candid personal opinion and also what you know with working within the government, United States government, international affairs era. In light of the last question asked by Sheikh Commissioner Cohen about America being more concerned about the economic interests and other things, there are rumors that the United States aided those overthrow of Topple's government. Do you have any information or clarification on this? Because that's the rumors that have been circulating. In fact, we've been reading about it in books.
I have no personal knowledge of that. At the time, it was 1980.
80 years.
1980, I was director of intelligence and research for the State Department, and I think if the U.S. had been involved, I would have known about it. I would have known about it. So I can state with almost certainty that the U.S. was not involved with that. It was a surprise.
Yes, and you haven't read about it anywhere like I have. You have not read about that?
I have not read about it, but I think I would have been in a position to know.
Okay.
All U.S. Intelligence activities have to go through the State Department. In 1980 to 1984, I was in charge of intelligence for State Department, and I can guarantee there's nothing like that came across my desk.
Thank you for that clarification. You stated that initially America did play a role in trying to get involved with, quote, this surrogate war in Liberia. And all of a sudden, you got this instruction to halt the discussion. Was that because of the Persian Gulf at that time and America were more concerned about diverting the interest in there? Perhaps you don't know the reason because he said he didn't know the reason. Could we just assume, or could you give us some assumption, some reason you think?
I don't think the Persian Gulf operation, you're quite right to ask that question because Persian Gulf War started in 90 and we were heavily involved. I know I was heavily involved in trying to get support in the Security Council from the African members who were Zaire, Ethiopia, and Ivory Coast. But I don't think that distracted us from what was going on in Liberia. We did take ships away from the Persian Gulf to put them offshore Liberia for the purpose of helping U.S. citizens get out. So that we did deprive U.S. forces of some ships. But I didn't think it had any relationship. The decisions made that we knew later, were not given to me immediately, was that there was this feeling that we didn't want to have Liberia become a ward of the United States. This was the interpretation. If they had asked me, I would have said, this is nonsense. Liberia would not become a ward of the United States. But that was higher level decision making.
Coming back again to this human rights violation in the manner in which President Doe was killed and died. From your statement, America had agreed to let President Doe leave, and President Iadima had agreed. So we could say now the manner in which he died, because perhaps he still felt that going to the port was a way of him escaping. Some medium of escape had been made for him, not really realizing that there was some reason to hold this decision. Are you aware, within your knowledge, whether he knew that the United States had decided to pull their hand away from giving him this safe passage? Do you know whether he was aware?
Yeah, he was aware of that. Our ambassador told him that. He was assassinated in ECOWAS headquarters.
Yeah.
So I think the question that I would ask if I were in your spot was, did ECOWAS have anything to do with his assassination? But I have no knowledge. I can assure you that he knew that we were no longer going to offer to take him out by air travel.
Refreshing my memory, did you go to Liberia 1989 or the early part of 1990?
I went in '89 No, I did not go in '89. My last visit had been in late '87,
Okay.
when we were talking to Doe about implementing these reforms.
I don't know whether you recall, because it was then, just like in 2003, when the women of Liberia played an important role in stopping this for the Peace Accra Comprehensive Peace Accord. And because of the situation with President Doe at that time, the women of Liberia met secretly with you at the U.S. Embassy. I remember then I headed that group with Grace Manon, Titi Bear, Titi Gripper, Edith Dennis, the late, they had a cross-section of women, but we had to meet secretly, and we all signed a petition with over 3,000 names, and giving you the view of the women of Liberia, and talking about the human rights abuses, and asking the United States to intervene, in fact, in trying to help us.
When was that?
It must have been '87. It was the last time.
'87, yes, I'm sure.
And although, you all saw Doe and the other people, but the women did give you a petition.
I remember that
It
now.
was recorded, because during the 1990s, when some of the women came trying to get their TPS, and so when you call their name, they refer to that document. So I want to say, truly, you did try to, you attempted to champion the peace and change the situation in the country using as best as you can, taking into consideration the United States diplomacy, how they feel about maybe their special interests versus the interests of others. We want to say thank you, and that's why at this time in our history, we couldn't leave you out, that by coming to participate with this process to give us what you know will help us, and history will judge you kindly. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert Crocker, for your testing, for your support of this process. First of all, I'm very happy and honored to hear your testimony. I felt, as I listened to you, that you gave us a very sincere expression of your heart, even though some of the things were delicate to say, and that will always be respected. But then I hope that you can also bear with us, as I may have 4 questions to ask you that may be delicate, but again, is in the interest of world peace and trying to understand how we can go forward in our country. The first one, I'm concerned about the 70s. In the 70s of Liberia, we are asked in the Commission to look into the root causes of our problems. And as you know, the coup of 1980 is like a root kickoff element, like the opening of a Pandora's box issue. So for us, it's very important to clearly understand what happened during that time. So as I looked into some areas of research, I realized that during that time, an American ambassador, Mr. Whitfield, was killed in Liberia. I noticed also during that time the communist fight, Cold War battle, was very strong, but yet our president tended to take a non-aligned posture, which could even be considered moving to the other side. And when I put all of this together with the fact that we had young Liberians here, which became later known to us as progressives, who wanted a change in the system, I was wondering whether you could shed any light on whether America could have assisted in any way this process during the 70s in Liberia with regards to the issue of 1980, just to clear the record, that's all. That would be first question.
That's a very important question to ask. I must admit that I was involved with other countries as a younger diplomat in the 70s. I was ambassador in Senegal in the 70s, so I didn't pay much attention to Liberia at the time. Before that, I was in Paris. In Paris, of course, you spend a lot of time with the French-speaking countries rather than the English-speaking. But I think the history of Liberia is not dissimilar to other countries. I think what you had there was minority rule, basically. And one of the big problems of big reasons for instability in a number of African countries is minority rule, where the majority feels excluded, where resources are concentrated within the minority, privileges, education, what have you. It was one of the problems in Rwanda and Burundi, where 15% of the people had all of the control. And I think this is what happened in Liberia. And over the years, pressure kept building up that this was unjust and it had to be changed. The manner of changing was rather unfortunate, the killing of Tolbert and what have you. But I think that's the reason you had this feeling that there was a need for justice in Liberia. I remember visiting, I think it was in this '87 visit, there was a cocktail party at the ambassador's, and I was meeting with some Liberian businessmen. And I said, well, how do you feel about the business situation under Doe? And he said, well, we're more comfortable with Doe than with Tolbert. Doe leaves us alone. He's corrupt, he steals from the state oil company and what have you, but he leaves us alone. Tolbert, every businessman had to have Tolbert as his partner, you see. The only way you can go into business was to be a partner of Tolbert. So some people felt more freedom under Doe than others, you see. But I believe that the fundamental issue in Liberia was minority rule. And there should have been a transition to majority rule, but there wasn't. And it came about by this unfortunate business in 1980. I remember the U.S. ambassador at the time, I think it was Perkins, wasn't it? His name was Perkins, or was it Swing? I forget which one of them. Was it Swing, yeah. And I asked Swing, well, what was the impact of 1980? And he said, well, it was popular. He says, a country boy had come to power, representing the majority. So the United States said, well, if it's popular, we're going to join it. But of course, there was disillusionment happened later when Doe was just as much a minority ruler as Tolbert was.
So, thank you. So in summary, you're saying that you don't think there was any American involvement in that process. It was just a natural thing that happened.
It was a natural thing. I'm quite sure that the U.S. did not orchestrate the events of 1980.
Okay, thank you. My second concern was you mentioned that when you talked to Doe and Taylor about opening this corridor of opportunity where Doe could probably escape. Now, I was wondering, what time did that conversation take place, that discussion? Just to get some clarity.
Well, it was the time we were trying to organize Doe's departure, and we knew, some people were saying, some people we trusted were saying that if Doe left, or Doe tried to leave, his own men would go against him, because here he would have been abandoning his own troops, you see. And he would be abandoning them to Taylor's coming in and killing them, because the emotions were so high. So our idea was let the troops escape so that Doe could escape. You see. So we talked to Taylor and we said, look, you're not capturing Monrovia. You've been telling us you're going to capture Monrovia for 3 months now. You never do it. It's always next week, next week. So the way to do it is to walk in, let Doe leave, and walk in and let the troops leave. So open this corridor. So he said, yes, I'll do that. And he actually did. He stopped the blockade of the road going to Sierra Leone. But then Prince Johnson came along and messed everything up, you see.
Yeah, the reason I was asking the question at the time was it seemed coincidental that Prince Johnson's decision to break away from Doe coincided with your headquarters giving you order of hands off for Liberia, or was there a difference in time?
I can't
and
recall
also the
that.
Liberian in the diaspora influencing the situation. So I was trying to see whether there was a relationship in there.
I'm not, my recollection of the exact time frame, it was all happening more or less at the same time, but I don't think Prince Johnson had any relationship to this. I think Prince Johnson got fed up with Taylor, who was, executing people, summarily executing people, and he didn't. I think he risked being executed himself if he didn't break away.
Thank you. The third one was, you mentioned about this situation where General Skrokov, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the exact name, made a statement to you that America had lost interest in Liberia in the sense it wasn't important enough and they didn't want to sort of take responsibility for Liberia as a whole. I hope I got that point clear.
Well, General Scowcroft was the National Security Advisor to President Bush, a highly respected national security expert. He didn't tell this to me. I got no explanation at the time. Just stop doing it.
Okay.
Later, he gave an interview to a journalist a couple of years later, and he said, we didn't want to bear the responsibility of taking care of Liberia. It was the same reason given why the U.S. did not overthrow Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War. If we had done that, Iraq would be under our responsibility for many, many years.
In fact, that was my exact question I was going to ask.
So it was the same reason, and it was happening at the same time, you see. We don't want to take care of Iraq forever. We don't want to take care of Liberia forever. It was the same reasoning, but I was not given that as Assistant Secretary. I was just told, stop doing it. Now, if they had given me the reason, I would have argued against that. I would have said there's no reason to think we'd have to take care of Liberia for the rest of their lives. They would just go on with their lives as before, you see. But I was not asked my opinion on that.
Again, I'm sorry that you have to deal with these questions, but it's just that you're here. The question comes to me because I noticed later now you did go into Iraq. And so I assumed that the interest there was not to help Iraq, but it became more of a self-interest. And then I think about Liberia's historical relationship to America and how that decision was to leave Liberia alone. And so I wonder somehow how this can be resolved as we are trying to create a world community of peace. Yeah. Whether there is anything being done in the new global paradigm to change from that self-interest politics issue and go towards really trying to find solutions to real problems. For example, the situation in Africa for the past couple of years, where Rwanda, Liberia, and et cetera, the world sits and watches these things happening, and we just realize that the only solution is for the bigger brothers, those who have the authority, the strength, to find a way to prevent things quickly. Because if you leave it to the ground forces to do it, their method is very destructive and destroys a lot of human rights and lives, etc. So I don't know whether you want to just share a little bit on this thought.
I think it's an excellent point. By the way, they went into Iraq because Iraq had invaded Kuwait. So that was the idea this was an illegal invasion of Kuwait, so they wanted to liberate Kuwait. Now, after that was done, people said, well, now you must get rid of Saddam Hussein, this evil dictator. But Bush said, no, that was not my mission. My mission was to free Kuwait. And if I go in and get rid of Saddam Hussein, we'll be taking care of Iraq for many years, which is the same reason they gave for Liberia, which was probably, in the case of Iraq, a sound reason, because we're suffering from that now. But I think the world has changed a lot since those days. Right now, look at all the UN peacekeeping operations around Africa and around the world. A tremendous amount of them. I remember when the UN peacekeeping budget in the US Congress was about $30 million a year, when we sent peacekeepers to Namibia for Namibian independence. Now it's $3 billion a year for peacekeeping. Just the US share of that, which is 60%. And there's a lot of nation building going on. Kosovo, Macedonia, Bosnia. So there is a hands-on approach. Now, it's not very efficient. It doesn't always work. But it's much better now. I think if Liberia happened now, you would have peacekeepers, you'd have police trainers, you'd have all sorts of reconstruction teams out there. But in those days, it hadn't happened yet, you see. But I think the situation has improved from what I understand your concern. I think the situation is much better now than it was in those days, but still not perfect.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. and for sharing your own experience you had with our situation. You said at one point you were stopped from going into negotiations to stop the war. My question is, if you had not been stopped by Washington, would you have been successful in stopping the war in Liberia at that time?
You mean if we had been allowed to continue?
Yes, with the negotiations.
Well, it's hard to say, but I think our scenario seemed to be working pretty well. Doe would leave, his army would escape through the corridor, and Charles Taylor would walk in and take power. Now, this was before ECOWAS came in. This was all before ECOWAS came in. And then, of course, the question would be, how would Taylor rule the country? His later experience of ruling the country was not too good, but at that point, it may have been a different Charles Taylor. You know, he would not have had to fight his way in and what have you. But at least the country would have been spared the total destruction of infrastructure and agriculture and what have you. So I think it would have worked well, and then maybe diplomacy could have persuaded Taylor to do the right thing in terms of being a good leader rather than a bad leader. But it may not have worked. But I think everyone was so anxious to end this problem that it probably would have worked out.
And the second one is.
By the way, I was going to go on the plane with Joe. I was ready. I was ready to fly to Monrovia and accompany him to Lomé when I was told to stop. I came that close. It was very close.
Okay, you keep saying taking care of Liberia. You said that America did not want to end up taking care of Liberia if they had come in to stop it. And so they decided to withdraw. I just want to understand what it entailed taking care of Liberia.
What does that mean?
What it entailed.
Excuse me?
What it entails.
What is entailed?
Yeah.
In taking care of Liberia?
Yeah.
Look at Iraq today. The U.S. is spending billions there trying to reconstruct that country. So the idea is that if we had done that, we would have been morally obligated to reconstruct Liberia. This was the thinking of people, you see. I don't think that was true, but this was the analysis that was given. In effect, Liberia would become a post-colonial colony of the United States, which I think would have been a good thing.
And compared to the amount of atrocities that were committed, I'm looking at taking care and then the amount of people who died and what happened there.
Yeah, sure. It was.
If you compare the two.
It was bad because the war went on until 7 years, I believe. Certainly, the comparison is totally on the side of we made a big mistake at that time. Yeah, I would agree with that.
And another thing I wanted to, with your knowledge and your experience, when you talk about democracy, we found out that in America, you said in Africa at that time, in the 70s, we had like the one-party system. That was not democracy. And so when you talk about democracy, you talk about everyone coming in to see or to have their own ideas as to what to do, and people accepting them for what they are. And so you find out in America you have only two parties, which is the Democrat and the Republican. So I want to ask, democracy has been preached for a very long time by the U.S., and we find out that you have only two parties. In Africa, since we started practicing democracy, we find out that whenever we have elections, we have a whole line of parties. Like Liberia alone, this last election was how many parties? 25? Almost 30.
How many parties?
Almost 30 parties.
30 parties.
Yes. So I just want to know, which form do you think is the best way of practicing democracy to stop all of these atrocities? Because as I sit here and listen, and to the role that America actually played in the Liberian War, it's something that is very touching to me.
Sure.
Because we know what really happened in America, in Liberia. And to hear even that I do not want to take care of Liberia, and so stop.
Yeah.
It's something that is touching to me.
Sure. Well,
And, so I want to know, how can we stop this? How can we stop people from going at each other? How can we stop a small country like Liberia from having 30 parties? And a big country like America has only 2. And so you have election in this country, you have no problems.
Well, that's a very interesting point. There are a lot of experts on democracy who are available to give advice. Look at France. France is a pretty good democracy. They have 10 parties. So they managed to work it out pretty well. The UK has 3. My feeling is that the proliferation of parties is a problem for Africa because so often some of these parties are just one family. Right? So they just want to participate. But there are a lot of techniques. For example, Germany has a very good system where they say if you don't get 5% of the vote, then you can't get into parliament. So that automatically eliminates a lot of these smaller parties. You see, there are all sorts of constitutional methodology to narrow it down to the parties that are truly representative of large segments of the population. And I'm sure that there are a lot of American experts who would be happy to go to Liberia and advise on the constitutional ways, not of forcing people, but to make it so that the smallest, the least popular are eliminated early if they don't get enough votes. It's quite possible to work it out. I remember in 1991, I went to see President Mobutu of Zaire. I said, look, everyone's doing democracy now. You better do it too, because otherwise you'll be swept away by the forces of history. He said, well, you're right. Okay, so he went out and announced there's going to be multi-party democracy, and the people cheered. So what did he do? He took a lot of money and he created parties. He says, you want democracy? I'll give you plenty of it. So he created all these parties, and his party was always winning because all these other little parties were, destroying each other. So there are constitutional ways, but I think there's enough experience out there so that you can set up a system where the parties can exist. You can't stop people from forming parties, but you could eliminate them early if they don't show support.
And my question is, because most of the time you find people wanting to have a place or even to have an identity is what causes most of the problems we experience as human beings. And so people wanting to be a part of the system, you have a one-party system and everybody wanting to be a part of it. And so we really need, as Africans, coming into something that is strange to us, that we do not know about, but that other people have been practicing for many years. We need someone to really come and guide us. Because most of the time, if you are not guided properly, you find yourself going into these kind of problems that we experience.
That's right, yeah. Democracy is not easy. It's very difficult. But still, it's the least bad of all systems.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right.
you, Mr. Chairman. Is it on? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Witness. Let me join my colleagues in expressing thanks to you again for taking time off your busy schedule to come and share with us your own experiences in the Liberian situation. Thank you very much. In 1980, of course, it's an open secret, we had the military coup staged by the late President Samuel Doe. That coup was very bloody. A lot of people got killed, including the president. And 10 days later, 13 of his government officials were put on hold and executed. And through the years between 1980 to 85, it was well established that Doe was incapable of ruling Liberia or of being its president. Human rights violation reached an all-high and was very common. Opposition leaders were often imprisoned, including student leaders. People were getting missing. There was a suspension of the Constitution, and he rigged the 1985 elections, and so forth. But notwithstanding, within the same period, the United States government under President Reagan gave a lot of support to the government of President Doe at the time, up to the tune of more than $1 billion. And you just stated in your comment to us that the government at the time supported Mr. Doe basically militarily. My question here is, why did the U.S. government think it was necessary to pump all that kind of money, taxpayers' resources, into a government that was clearly tyrannic and despotic?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, as I said before, virtually every African country was in a similar situation. Despotic, corrupt, totally absence of democracy, political prisoners. This was true all over Africa. So Liberia, we could not consider Liberia to be a special case. We had relations with the government, they were very cooperative with us, and they were more cooperative with the United States than any other African government. When Doe said we were your best friend in Africa, it was right. Liberia was. So you can go back and with historic hindsight and say, well, we should not have done that because it was a bad regime. But then at the same time, we would have stopped giving assistance to 80% of African regimes if we had the same attitude. At that time, we were not basing our policies on the absence of democracy. We were not. It started later. Maybe we should have, but that was it. So Liberia was not different, you see. If all the countries were democracies and suddenly Doe came in and did what he did, it would have been a different story. But it was the same as all other countries. What was different about Liberia was the total incompetence of Doe. He didn't have the slightest inkling of how to manage anything, you see. And that should have been a signal to us that it was not a good thing. But since his ability, his willingness to support the United States in anything we wanted, it was very hard for us to put that aside, you see. Roberts Field, CIA antenna field, Voice of America antenna field, tracking station for satellites, transatlantic navigation station. It was all there. One thing I did that I thought would have been a little gesture is I increased the rent that we were paying. The rent we were paying was so low. I said, this is ridiculous. So at least we increased the rent. But otherwise, the whole issue of democracy was not on the table in those days.
Just a follow-up to that question. We know the U.S. has a track record for preaching human rights and for promoting and supporting the values of human rights throughout the world. From what you just stated, can one rightly assume then that the U.S. policy on maybe Africa or other countries when it comes to its interests will vary? For example, you stated that even though Samuel Doe had a track record for doing the wrong things, but because he was a friend of the U.S., so the U.S. supported him at the time.
I didn't quite understand what you're saying.
Okay, let me see if I can rephrase the question. From the response you just gave, is it rightful then to assume that even though one may have a huge human rights records, but if he's a friend of the U.S., then he gets supported? Because you said at that time, a lot of African countries, like 90%, had the issue of lack of democracy and everything, but that wasn't your focus. You supported Samuel, your government supported Samuel Doe at the time because Samuel Doe was a friend of the U.S. and he cooperated with the U.S. even though he had this trail of human rights abuses at home.
Well, as I said before, we did not consider the Samuel Doe government to be much different from all the others. They all had human rights abuses. Actually, the Samuel Doe government human rights record was not as bad as a lot of other countries. For example, Idi Amin in Uganda. This was so bad that we had no relations with them. We couldn't even keep an embassy there. So there was various degrees, but we did not see the Samuel Doe government's record on human rights as being that different from the others. So we had no grounds for really treating Liberia differently. Plus, as you say, the fact that we had such tremendous support from Doe, this was an element in our thinking. But I don't think we would have been negative toward Doe even without all of that support. It was just part of the same pattern that we had in Africa. Now, the U.S. was not going around Africa telling people, you've got to change, you've got to do this. We did not want to be accused of neo-colonialism. I was talking to the president of the Congo on May the 3rd, and he said to me, would Obama be good for Africa? I said, be careful. He said, we white people, we couldn't say a lot of things to you. You accuse us of being neo-colonialists, but Obama's going to be tough. He could say things to you that you're going to have to listen. So we did not want to get into this business of telling Africans what to do. Later, we got into that, you see. But even then, we're very careful. But in those days, we just did not tell Africans what to do. In fact, even on economic things, we were so worried about telling Africans what to do that we found somebody else to do it. We found a bad cop to go in there. It was the World Bank. The World Bank went in there and shook the Africans and say, you got to change. We were not doing that because of our sensitivity. And that was the same thing with Liberia.
Okay. My second question borders around a comment of yours during the time of the Liberian crisis. In September of 1990, just after the late President Samuel Doe was captured and brutally killed by Prince Johnson at the time, and when Liberia was in a state of chaos, and you rightly stated you were working very hard behind the scene, negotiating in between the various factions and speaking with the various players to end the war. But then you also, on Taylor's territory, some of us were actually in Taylor's territory. We were hiding. I was a journalist at the time. I was hiding with a group of reporters for fear of our lives. And we lived by the radio, had a transistor radio, and we lived to listen to BBC, which we thought was more accurate in this news, and also to what the Americans were saying about the war, because at that time all Liberians were hopeful that the Americans would step in to do something about the war. And there was just death everywhere, all around us. People were completely hopeless. And after one of your meetings with Mr. Taylor, you gave an interview over the BBC, And in that interview, you stated that Charles Taylor was a man that the United States could do business with. And I guess that comment bordered around the fact that Doe was already dead and Taylor had the largest force or whatsoever. But the comment was a bit disturbing. We were very frightened, living in Taylor territory and seeing all of the chaos and all of the killings and everything. So my question here is, why did the U.S., because you were an official member of the U.S. government at the time, in the midst of all of the chaos and everything that Taylor was doing, executing people all over the place, why did the U.S. think that Taylor was the man to do business with at that time?
Well, at that point, we believed that this was kind of the only solution. Our main concern was getting the war over with. So if it meant dealing with Taylor, we thought that was the best possible, the least bad arrangement. That was all. We had no illusions about Taylor, although he got a lot worse later after he became president. But the whole idea was to stop the war.
Okay. My last question, President Jimmy Carter was also very instrumental in trying to stop the Liberian War, especially in its early stage. And he was back and forth in Liberia trying to negotiate when ECOWAS was there. And he was accused by, sometimes other sides of Liberians as having been biased towards Mr. Taylor. And one of the accusations centered around the fact that in 1995, he met with Mr. Taylor, tried to get him to agree to disarm to ECOWAS, and agreed for elections in 1997. And President Carter went to meet with Mr. Taylor in Greater Liberia. It was covered by the international media and also Liberian journalists who were brave enough to go to Mr. Taylor's territory. And after President Carter left from Greater Liberia and came back to Liberia to meet with the interim government at the time, he thought that Mr. Taylor was ready to end the war, and he had encouraged the ECOWAS forces at the time to reduce its concentration of soldiers that they had around the buffer zone area bordering Taylor's territory and ECOWAS and the interim government territory. And that advice was taken into consideration. The West African Peacekeeping Force reduced its forces from around Taylor's area, and only to know that Taylor was actually preparing for war, what we now refer to as the April 6, 1986 war. My question here is, you also dealt with Mr. Taylor extensively. Do you think, do you now feel from where you sit now, do you think Mr. Taylor actually deceived the United States?
Well, you're speaking about his promises to Carter, right?
Yes, his promises to Carter. He made a couple of promises to the U.S. government. He was going to disarm. He was going to go to elections, and none of these things happened. President Carter met with him. In all honesty, he encouraged him to allow the peacekeeping troops to reduce their forces around his area. He was going to disarm, he was going to go to elections, and right after that, we went into full-scale war.
Right. Well, my recollection is that Taylor signed many agreements. He went to Yamoussoukro, I think, about 8 times, and each time he signed an agreement, and none of them did he implement. So if he didn't implement those agreements, his lying to Carter was part of the pattern. He just did not trust ECOWAS. He felt they were out to get him, and that his only solution was to get rid of ECOWAS and allow him to take over. Now, what point did he finally give in? President Abacha of Nigeria had a conversation with him, and for some miraculous reason, Taylor accepted the solution. I'm sorry Abacha's dead. I'd like to interview him and find out what his magic was to cause Taylor to finally agree to something. You see. But he failed to implement every agreement that he signed up until that point, including Carter.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for coming and providing us the opportunity to together explore the history of Liberia-U.S. relationships and how those relationships have impacted mutually on each of us. In your presentation, you tried to you give an outline of the long-standing ties between the U.S. and Liberia. And perhaps as a way of starting, let me just provide some further background. You recall that during the United States 1787 Constitutional Convention, the issue of equality was raised on whether the slaves, black people at the time, were to be considered equal to whites, and it was unanimously agreed that that issue would be deferred for at least 20 years. That was 1787. In 1808, 1807, we saw the creation of the United States Agency for Recaptured Africans that eventually led Captain Robert Stockton, later on became a congressman in the U.S., aboard his ship, the USS Alligator, that landed at the shores of Monrovia, pointing a pistol to the head of King George, King Peter, and others, and forcing an agreement to cede a portion of land that today is known as the Republic of Liberia. Further on, we saw and as a matter of fact, despite that recognition of Liberia did not come until way about 1865 during the United States Civil War, although Liberia was a creation of United States interest and United States policy. In the 1800s, we saw the recruitment of thousands of Liberians to work for the building of the Panama Canal. One of my great-great-uncles, as the story goes, was one of those recruited to go to Panama and never saw him again. Then, of course, in the 1900s, in 1917, at the behest of the United States, Liberia declared war against Germany and lost relationship with her major trading partner, Germany. And again, in the 1940s, Liberia declared war against Germany in the Second World War. Through the 60s, Monrovia, Liberia was the headquarters of the CIA in Africa. During the Angolan Civil War, Roberts Field was used for the lifting of arms to UNITA and FNLA. As my colleague said, the deciding vote for the creation of Israel was cast by Liberia in support of the U.S. So we have quite a long history. And our history is inextricably linked to yours. And so coming to 1990, the Liberian Civil War, I recall when the war began, I was a Red Cross volunteer, going to the front lines, and sometime thereabout in January, I had occasion to meet Colonel Richard Staley, who was the U.S. military advisor with the Liberian troops on the front line. And there were all these reports of atrocities being committed by the Liberian army, which was trained by U.S. military experts and being directed by U.S. military experts. And there were these reports that were coming in as he sat along with other Liberian commanders, including the defense minister at his headquarters, that atrocities were being committed by the Liberian army. As he rightly said, like a scorched earth policy. I was resident in Banga. We saw the massive looting and all of that. And we did not hear a whimper of protest by the United States as to the conduct of Liberian forces in containing the rebel incursion. The situation deteriorated rapidly, and the work of the Red Cross was interrupted. I briefly fled to Sierra Leone. But in the same year, September, I came back to do an assessment of the humanitarian situation. And at the time, Liberia was divided. Monrovia population had dwindled to about 80,000. The United States had about 10 to 15 tons of food in the warehouses in Monrovia. Starvation was everywhere. The ambassador then, John Peter DeVos, refused, despite pleadings, that this food be delivered to lactating mothers and pregnant women. But right at Harbel, there was food distribution going on. So why was this policy of biasness towards Taylor so manifest to the point that thousands of Liberians died as a result of such callous indifference to the sufferings of Liberia? That's the first question. And then, of course, we saw the presence of U.S. Marines. They came in briefly, put a cordon around the Mamba Point area, evacuated people, raised a lot of hopes that the U.S. was going to intervene. And suddenly it vanished, and the atrocities continued. During the period up to Octopus, there was still this slant, U.S. foreign policy slant towards Taylor as compared to the greater interests of Liberia. And, of course, during the Doe regime, as my colleague said, close to $1 billion worth of aid was provided to the Liberian government, mainly for the acquisition of military equipment. So my question is, as a former official of the United States government, would you support those who hold the opinion that the United States government does have a moral obligation to pay reparations to Liberia as a consequence of the destructive war and as a consequence of the United States' indifference to a situation which it could have averted? Do you share this opinion, or would you support those who make this call?
I do not share that opinion. I think if you're looking for reparations, you should go to Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. The war would never have occurred if Charles Taylor and his men had not been trained in Libya, sent to Burkina Faso, where they were given all this equipment, transported to Cote d'Ivoire, where they were given vehicles to take them inside Liberia to start the war. It would never have happened. The United States had nothing to do with starting the war. Perhaps U.S. conduct and failure to pursue peace vigorously is not grounds for reparations. We could have done more, but we had nothing to do with the war existing and taking place. But Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire are the ones who did it. You should go to them and say, look, why did you do it? Give us reparations. These are the guilty people.
But does that interpret to mean that the U.S. had no leverage over countries like Cote d'Ivoire, and it was well known that Libya was training, and Libya was a principal enemy of the United States at the time, and Libya was providing support, arms were coming from Libya? Does that suggest, we saw sanctions against several other countries by the U.S. So are you suggesting that the U.S. had no leverage at all over Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso to the point where it did not even raise a voice of protest to even threaten sanctions or something that it could have done nothing at all?
Well, I think we did make a mistake in not putting pressure on them at the time. But
So
we
what-
really didn't have that much leverage. Cote d'Ivoire is essentially strongly related to France. France was giving them aid. France didn't give a damn about Liberia. In fact, when we talked to French about putting pressure on the Cote d'Ivoire, they said, it's an American problem.
But yet, at the same time, Firestone was operating, and there's a major U.S. company, and deriving millions of dollars in profit. Yeah. So correspondingly, would you not think that there was some measure of, there's some degree of obligation that the U.S. owes to Liberia in this respect?
Well, obligation, you can argue that word, but I think the key people who owe Liberia reparations are Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. These are the ones. The United States perhaps didn't do a good job in trying to bring about the end of the war. I will agree to that. But that doesn't give the U.S. responsibility for paying reparations to the Liberian people. The U.S. spent quite a lot of money on that war. I mean, both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration spent hundreds of millions of dollars for humanitarian assistance to help the Liberian people during that war. It was the biggest amount anybody gave. So there's been a lot of money paid by the U.S. taxpayer as a result of that war. But in terms of taking responsibility for all of the bad things that happened, it's Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. Go there.
But don't you think that such huge amounts of money that you said has been spent would pale in comparison to to what Charles Taylor had even said, sending the Marines? Opportunity, if you look at the opportunity cost, don't you think such huge expense on humanitarian aid would certainly pale in comparison to a few thousand U.S. troops coming on the ground and stopping the war and preventing the destruction of infrastructure and human lives?
Yeah, well, these were errors which I would acknowledge should have not happened, but that doesn't make the U.S. responsible for everything that happened, all the bad things that happened in Liberia. What we did not do, there's a lot of countries that bad things are happening where we do not intervene. All over the world, including today. Kosovo today, we're not intervening. We're trying to get UN troops in there, but we're not sending US troops. So you can't say that the US has obligations to pay reparations to Sudan's people because we're not intervening. Not intervening is not grounds for paying reparations. Intervening with the intent of causing trouble is grounds for reparations. Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire are the ones who did that.
I'm talking about moral responsibility. Don't you think the U.S. has a moral responsibility in this regard?
I'm not sure I know the definition of that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come to this commission to give some clarification as to what the U.S. role was during the time of our conflict. And we also thank you so much for everything you did at that time, wanting to stop the war or the hostility, though it didn't happen. My question is actually a follow-up question as to what really happened in 1980. It's a popular belief that during 1980, it wouldn't have been possible for the 17 enlisted men to overthrow the government. But based on what you just said, that as security advisor at that time, we never came across any information as to the U.S. involvement in Liberia. Yet after the coup, there was increased aid to Liberian government at that time. And then after that, we noticed, or we saw, 10 days after, the ex-officials of the government were killed, and close relatives of the former president and the officials of government were denied entry to the U.S. Can you comment on that?
I'm sorry, I cannot comment because I was not involved with policy at that time. I'm not trying to evade the question, I just don't know what the policy considerations were. The only thing I can tell you is that the ambassador at the time told me later that the coup was considered to be the people of Liberia were happy at the time. That's the only thing I've learned. But in terms of these decisions about aid and visas and what have you, I have no knowledge of that.
My next question is, in your negotiation process, you were talking to Taylor and you talked to the former President Doe at the time. There was some form of consensus that they would open Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, for the government of armed forces of Liberia to leave. But this was aborted because Prince Johnson broke away. And you visited Liberia, you met Prince Johnson. Can you tell us what the discussion was? And you was unable to beat former President Doe. Why didn't you meet the president at that time?
Well, my discussion with Prince Johnson was not terribly useful. He was constantly on his radio. Incidents were happening all the time. He was constantly wanting to rush off. And so we really didn't get into much discussion. He just try to tell us that how much he was opposed to Taylor and he was going to defeat Taylor, what have you. But in terms of trying to get him to do the right thing, there was no basis for talking. I think he was basically a hysterical person. It was impossible to talk to him. He was just totally obsessed with getting rid of Taylor. So it was hard to talk to him about solving problems. I couldn't do that. And he had to rush out quickly because someone telephoned and said, they're attacking here, we need help. So he ran out. So it was really not a very productive discussion.
And then did you make any effort at that time to meet the President Doe? Because you were already in Monrovia.
Yes, the ambassador tried to get me to see President Doe, but it didn't work out. Whether he refused to see me or there's some other reason, we never knew, but could not get an appointment with him at that time. Earlier I'd been rather tough with Doe when we were talking about the reforms, so maybe he didn't want to see me for that reason.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, once more for coming to share these moments with us. I want to ask, do you think the establishment of Liberia has eventually turned out to be an embarrassment for the U.S. and a foreign policy headache, given all we have discussed and what you have said? Here is a very close ally, but yet a hands-off policy has been maintained over the years.
I didn't quite get the question, I'm sorry.
Has Liberia become a foreign policy headache for the U.S. and perhaps an embarrassment?
Has Liberia become an embarrassment for the U.S.? No, actually, it's one of the ironies of history. My superiors said we should not pursue peace operations in Liberia because we would have to take care of Liberia. I think right now what has happened is we're taking care of Liberia. After all those years, we're finally taking care of Liberia.
Putting U.S. foreign policy in relationship to Liberia in context, how would you describe the relationship between Washington and Monrovia under the leadership of President Talbot, where foreign assistance, technical assistance were virtually non-existent, if not low, as compared to that of the military leader Samuel Doe, where there was a significant leap in foreign military and other assistance to the point of a little more than $500 million in less than 3 to 4 years?
Well, Doe clearly was a military person. He wanted to enhance the military. He wanted better barracks and what have you. So that was one way of keeping his friendship, was to provide military assistance. There was no basis for economic assistance because Liberia, under his administration, was unable to deal with it, to manage it, or to absorb it. But military was something that kept his loyalty.
What's about Talbot?
Talbot, we didn't need it. Talbot was just very happy with with the relationship. There was no need for any special assistance. I regret now, and historically, I think we should have given military assistance to Talbot, to build up the morale of the army, so there would not have been a coup.
During the war in 1989 up to 2003, was military intervention ever an option?
Never.
Never an option?
No.
Okay. We want to say thanks very much for taking up your time and sharing these moments with us. We assure you that it has contributed immensely to the search of our country for redemption, healing, and national reconciliation. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Welcome.